Tonight, the world has crossed a threshold that every energy economist, every naval strategist, and every geopolitical analyst has been modeling in classified documents and academic papers for decades, but that the comfortable assumptions of the post-Cold War insisted would never actually arrive. It has arrived, and its arrival has detonated with a force that is reshaping the global order in real time. 600 Fate 313 ballistic missiles, Iran's most advanced, most precise, most operationally refined surface-to-surface weapon system, were fired in a coordinated salvo that the Strait of Hormuz has never witnessed in its entire history of strategic contestation. The target package was not military installations, it was not radar sites or command bunkers, it was the economic jugular of the Western-led global order. American oil tankers, fully loaded, transiting the world's most critical energy choke point under the assumption that American naval dominance would protect them as it always had. That assumption died last night. 12 vessels, each carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude petroleum, each representing hundreds of millions of dollars in cargo and whole value, each crewed by maritime professionals who believed the flags flying above them constituted meaningful protection, were struck with the kind of precision that the Fate 313's terminal guidance system was specifically designed to deliver. The fires burning on the surface of the Strait of Hormuz are visible from satellite imagery across a stretch of water that has now become effectively impassable. Hormuz is dead, not metaphorically, not temporarily disrupted in the way that previous Iranian harassment operations have created manageable friction for commercial shipping. Dead in the operational sense that no commercial vessel operator on the planet is currently willing to send a ship through those waters, that insurance underwriters have suspended coverage for Gulf transits entirely, and that the physical hazard of burning wreckage, released petroleum, and the demonstrated willingness and capability of Iran to strike vessels at will has converted the world's most critical energy transit point into a no-go zone of indefinite duration. The consequences are already cascading through global markets with a velocity that no economic model fully captured, because no economic model fully believed this scenario would actually materialize. Oil prices have broken through levels that analysts called impossible 6 months ago. Financial markets from Tokyo to Frankfurt to New York are registering the kind of synchronized collapse that central bank emergency protocols were designed to address, but were not designed to address when the trigger event is an indefinite physical closure of the channel through which a fifth of the world's traded oil flows. And in Washington, an administration that built its regional posture on the premise of restored deterrence of Iranian restraint in the face of American strength of a rules-based order enforced by the credible threat of American military response, is confronting the most comprehensive strategic failure of any American administration in the Middle East since the Iranian Revolution itself. The word collapse is not hyperbole. It is the most precise available description of what is happening to the architecture of American strategic credibility in this theater at this moment. What exactly did 600 Fate 313 missiles do to 12 oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz? And why was the American naval presence unable to prevent it? What does this weapon system represent in terms of Iranian strategic investment and operational capability? How has Washington responded? And what does that response reveal about the genuine dimensions of American strategic exposure? And what does a world look like in which Hormuz is closed not for days, but potentially for weeks or months, while the global economy absorbs a supply shock that no modern energy market has ever actually experienced? Those are the questions that demand the kind of unsparing strategic analysis that only this channel is prepared to deliver. If you are watching this because you understand that the mainstream narrative is managing your perception of events rather than informing it, hit like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. The truth about what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz tonight is too important to be filtered through the frameworks of the institutions that failed to prevent it. Part 1. 600 missiles and 12 burning tankers, the anatomy of a strategic detonation. To understand what 600 FT-313 ballistic missiles did to 12 American oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, you must first understand the geometry of the engagement, because the geometry explains everything about why the American naval presence that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario was unable to do so. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point is approximately 33 kilometers wide. Through that 33-kilometer channel at any given moment, there are dozens of vessels, tankers, container ships, naval vessels, support craft navigating the designated traffic separation schemes that organize commercial transit through one of the most congested maritime choke points on the planet. The tankers targeted last night were operating in exactly the kind of formation that the traffic separation scheme requires. Identifiable, trackable, moving at the predictable speeds that fully loaded supertankers maintain following courses that Iranian maritime surveillance had been monitoring for days. The Fate 313 is not a weapon that was designed for this mission last week. It is the product of a sustained Iranian ballistic missile development program that has been iterating on the Fate family of short-range ballistic missiles for over 2 decades, with each successive variant incorporating improved propulsion, improved accuracy, and improved terminal guidance that has progressively narrowed the gap between ballistic missile delivery and precision-guided munition delivery. The 313 variant, named for a number of particular religious and historical significance in Shia Islamic tradition, represents the current apex of that development arc. Its range of approximately 500 kilometers means that launch platforms positioned deep within Iranian territory, well beyond the reach of any immediate American counter-B response, can engage targets throughout the entire Strait of Hormuz and across the broader Persian Gulf. It's circular error probable. The standard measure of targeting accuracy has been refined through successive testing and operational deployment to a figure that makes it genuinely capable of hitting a specific vessel in a specific location, rather than simply saturating a geographic area and hoping for statistical results. 600 of them were fired in a coordinated salvo architecture designed with the explicit objective of overwhelming the layered American naval air defense systems operating in the strait. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers providing escort and area air defense, the Aegis combat systems running continuous threat tracking across the electromagnetic spectrum. All of these were active. All were performing their design functions, and all were collectively insufficient to intercept the volume of simultaneous inbound threats that the salvo generated. The mathematics of missile defense against a salvo of this size are unforgiving. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries a standard missile inventory sufficient to engage a meaningful number of simultaneous inbound threats, but not 600. The Aegis system's engagement sequencing, however sophisticated its algorithms, must process threats in sequence and in time, and when the volume of simultaneous inbounds exceeds the throughput capacity of the combined battle group's interceptor inventory, the residual threats reach their targets. 600 Fate 313 missiles represent a salvo sized with precisely this calculation in mind. Iranian targeting of the 12 specific vessels selected from the transit traffic reflected intelligence preparation of the battlefield that had been ongoing for days. The vessels selected were not random. They were American-flagged or American-chartered tankers whose selection would maximize the political and economic impact of their destruction, while simultaneously sending the most direct possible message to Washington about the cost of maintaining its regional posture. Each vessel was assigned a specific number of Fate 313 missiles calculated to ensure destruction rather than damage, a targeting allocation that reflects both the confidence in the weapon's accuracy and the strategic intent to create an unambiguous outcome rather than an ambiguous near miss. The engagement unfolded across a window of approximately 18 minutes from first launch detection to final impact. American naval forces had that window to process the threat, execute intercept attempts, and attempt to warn the targeted vessels. The intercept attempts were real. Standard missiles were fired. The Aegis systems performed their design functions, and a meaningful number of incoming Fate 313 missiles were destroyed before reaching their targets. But the salvo was sized to absorb those intercepts and still deliver sufficient warheads to the target set to achieve the operational objective. 12 tankers burning simultaneously in the Strait of Hormuz is not a military victory measured in traditional terms. It is a strategic detonation, an event whose consequences propagate through the global system in ways that dwarf the immediate physical destruction. The fires on the water are the visible symbol of something much larger. The demonstrated failure of American naval deterrence to protect commercial shipping through the world's most critical energy choke point. When that failure becomes visible, when it burns on satellite imagery for the entire world to observe simultaneously, the behavioral consequences cascade immediately. Every commercial vessel operator with ships anywhere near the Gulf made the same decision within hours: divert, delay, suspend. Lloyd's of London and the broader marine insurance market suspended Gulf transit coverage before the fires had finished burning. The traffic separation scheme that organizes Hormuz transit became academic within 12 hours as the commercial shipping industry collectively determined that no cargo value justifies transiting a body of water where 12 vessels have just been destroyed in a single engagement. Hormuz closed not by Iranian decree, not by naval blockade in the traditional sense, by the operational reality that Iran had demonstrated the will and the capability to destroy vessels transiting it, and that no commercial or governmental actor was willing to test whether that demonstration was a one-time event or the inauguration of a sustained denial campaign. Part 2. The Fate 313 and the arsenal behind it. Iran's maritime strike capability exposed. The 600 Fate 3 and 13 missiles fired last night represent the most visible operational deployment of a capability that Iran has been developing and concealing with extraordinary strategic discipline across the better part of 3 decades. But they represent only one component of a maritime strike architecture whose full dimensions are substantially more concerning than any single weapon system, however capable. Understanding what Iran has actually built in the domain of anti-ship and maritime area denial capability requires stepping back from the immediate drama of last night's engagement and tracing the strategic investment decisions that produced it, because those decisions reflect a coherent, patient, and brilliantly executed strategic logic that the Western analytical community consistently failed to take seriously until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Iran's maritime strategy was shaped by a foundational assessment made in the aftermath of the 1988 Operation Praying Mantis, the American naval engagement that destroyed a substantial portion of the Iranian surface fleet in a single day of combat. The lesson drawn from that engagement by Iranian strategic planners was not that Iran needed a better surface fleet. It was that surface fleets are inherently vulnerable to American naval power in direct symmetric confrontation, and that Iran's security interests required a fundamentally different approach to maritime warfare, one that could impose unacceptable costs on American naval operations without requiring Iran to win a conventional naval engagement. The resulting investment program focused on 3 interlocking capability domains. First, anti-ship missile systems capable of engaging large vessels at ranges that kept the launch platforms beyond the immediate response capacity of American naval forces. Second, naval mine warfare capabilities designed to deny access to the Strait and the broader Gulf through persistent, distributed, difficult to neutralize hazards. Third, asymmetric surface warfare using large numbers of fast attack craft capable of swarming American naval vessels and overwhelming their close-end defense systems through volume and speed. The Fate 313 sits at the apex of the first domain, the long-range precision anti-ship missile capability, but beneath it in the capability architecture is a layered inventory of additional systems that provide coverage across different ranges, different target types, and different engagement geometries. The NOR anti-ship cruise missile, an Iranian development derived from the Chinese C-82 system, provides a sea-coming engagement profile that presents a fundamentally different intercept challenge than the ballistic trajectory of the Fate 313. The KG-FARS, an earlier member of the Fate family specifically optimized for anti-ship engagement, provides additional capacity at somewhat shorter ranges. Together, these systems give Iranian planners the ability to engage targets throughout the Strait and the broader Gulf from multiple launch platforms operating from dispersed positions across Iranian territory and the Iranian coastline, creating a targeting problem for American forces that cannot be solved by attacking any single node or platform type. The naval mine inventory deserves particular attention because it represents the capability most likely to sustain the Hormuz closure beyond the immediate aftermath of last night's missile engagement. Iran is assessed to possess thousands of naval mines of various types, contact mines, influence mines that detonate in response to the magnetic signature or acoustic signature of passing vessels, and sophisticated bottom lines that can be programmed to activate after a specified delay or after a specified number of vessels have passed over them. These mines can be delivered by submarine, by surface vessel, by aircraft, and potentially by unmanned underwater vehicles, making comprehensive mine countermeasure operations extraordinarily difficult and time-consuming. The practical reality of naval mine warfare is that clearing a minefield is one of the most dangerous, labor-intensive, and time-consuming operations in naval warfare. Even a relatively small number of mines, if their presence is confirmed or even suspected, can close a shipping lane indefinitely because no commercial vessel operator or insurance underwriter is willing to accept the risk of mine contact when alternative routing is available. The combination of confirmed missile strikes on 12 vessels and the known Iranian mine warfare capability creates a deterrent effect that will persist long after any immediate military action. Iran's fast attack craft force, numbering in the hundreds, operated primarily by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy in the confined waters of the Gulf, provides the asymmetric surface component of the maritime denial architecture. These vessels are too small and too numerous to be efficiently engaged by the large caliber weapon systems of American destroyers and cruisers. Too fast to be easily tracked and targeted in the cluttered electromagnetic environment of the Gulf and capable of saturating the close-in defense systems of any individual American warship through sheer volume of simultaneous approach vectors. The operational doctrine that ties these capabilities together, the doctrine that last night's engagement executed at operational scale, is what Iranian military planners called the mosaic defense concept. A distributed, multi-domain, multi-vector engagement strategy in which no single component is individually decisive, but the combination creates an engagement environment that exceeds the response capacity of any adversary force operating in the theater. 600 Fate 313 missiles were the headline, the naval mines being seated in their wake, the fast attack craft now patrolling the approaches, the additional missile batteries repositioned and reloaded. These are the system that will sustain the closure that the missiles inaugurated. Iran did not fire 600 missiles to sink 12 tankers. It fired 600 missiles to demonstrate that it could to activate the broader maritime denial architecture that the missile strike inaugurated, and to force the global shipping industry and the American political system to confront a strategic reality that deterrence rhetoric had been papering over for years. Part 3, Washington in free fall. The collapse of American deterrence and the panic that follows. There is a specific quality of institutional panic that distinguishes itself from ordinary crisis management, and it is visible in Washington tonight in a way that experienced observers of American strategic behavior will recognize immediately. It is not the panic of surprise. American strategic planners knew that Iran possessed the capability to execute an operation of this kind. It is the panic of confirmation. The moment when a scenario that has been modeled, war-gamed, and strategically dreaded for years actually materializes, and every downstream consequence that the models predicted begins unfolding simultaneously in real time. The immediate military response options available to the administration are real but deeply constrained by a set of second and third order consequences that make every available course of action carry costs that the political system is struggling to process. Option 1, direct military strikes against the Iranian missile launch infrastructure responsible for last night's engagement, confronts the fundamental problem that the Fate 313 batteries are mobile, dispersed across the broad Iranian strategic depth, and already repositioning following the engagement. Striking the launch positions that fired last night's salvo would destroy empty terrain. Striking the broader Iranian missile infrastructure would require a campaign of sufficient scale and duration to constitute an act of war against the Iranian state, triggering the full spectrum of Iranian retaliatory options, including attacks on American bases throughout the region, activation of the full Hezbollah military capability against Israel, a Houthi escalation against Saudi and Emirati infrastructure, and the very Hormuz closure that last night's events have already effectively produced through commercial market behavior. Option 2, deploying additional naval forces to escort commercial shipping through the strait confronts the operational reality that 12 tankers were just destroyed despite the presence of a carrier strike group in the theater. Adding additional naval assets improves the intercept mathematics but does not solve them. A sufficiently large salvo of Fate 313 missiles will overwhelm any realistic American naval presence in the confined waters of the strait, and Iran has demonstrated that it possesses both the inventory and the willingness to fire at that scale. Option 3. Negotiating a framework for resuming commercial transit in exchange for Iranian security guarantees confronts the political reality that an administration that has defined itself in opposition to engagement with Iran, that has characterized any accommodation with throne as appeasement, cannot pivot to negotiation in the immediate aftermath of the most devastating Iranian military action against American interests in the history of the relationship. Ship without a political cost that threatens the administration's domestic viability. None of these options is good. None of them is clean. And the administration's public communications since the engagement have reflected this absence of good options in the most visible possible way. Contradictory statements from different officials, delays between events and official acknowledgments, the particular kind of message discipline breakdown that occurs when an institution is genuinely uncertain about what it wants to say, because it is genuinely uncertain about what it wants to do. The economic consequences are compounding the political ones at a velocity that is testing the administration's ability to manage multiple simultaneous crises. Oil prices breaking through historic records is not an abstract financial event. It is a consumer price event that transmits to gasoline prices within days and to broader inflation metrics within weeks. And that hits hardest the working class voters whose economic concerns most directly shape American electoral politics. An administration whose approval ratings were already under pressure from inflation concerns is now watching the most direct and visible inflation driver imaginable materialize from a strategic failure in its own foreign policy theater. The Federal Reserve is in emergency session. Treasury is coordinating with the Strategic Petroleum Reserves Management to assess what release volumes are operationally possible and what price impact they can realistically achieve against a supply disruption of this magnitude. The answers being generated by those assessments are not reassuring. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, while substantial, was not sized to substitute for the volume of petroleum that transit swore moves daily. And any release program that is actually large enough to meaningfully affect prices would deplete the reserve faster than any previous administration has been willing to contemplate. Congressional reaction is splitting along the predictable partisan lines, but with an intensity that reflects the genuine severity of what has occurred. Members who have argued for years that the administration's Iran posture was inadequate to the actual threat environment are using the moment with maximum political force. Members who have supported the administration are struggling to articulate a defense of a posture that just produced the outcome. It was specifically designed to prevent the resulting legislative environment is producing pressure for responses, military, economic, diplomatic, that are simultaneously contradictory and urgent, and that are making coherent executive branch decision-making more rather than less difficult. Allies in the Gulf are conducting their own emergency assessments that are producing outcomes unfavorable to American interests. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, whose own energy export infrastructure depends on Hormuz's access and whose security arrangements with Washington rest on the credibility of American deterrence, are absorbing the strategic lesson of last night. With the particular clarity of actors whose national survival is directly implicated, quiet communications to Beijing and Moscow seeking to understand what alternative frameworks of regional security might be available are already underway. American deterrence credibility is a perishable commodity, and last night's events have accelerated its consumption in the Gulf states at a rate that Washington's crisis managers are struggling to arrest. The panic in Washington is real, but it is not irrational. It is the entirely rational response of a political and strategic system confronting the simultaneous collapse of its regional deterrence posture, its economic insulation from Gulf supply shocks, and its political narrative about the nature and effectiveness of its Iran policy. All in the span of 18 minutes of missile flight time over the Strait of Hormuz. Part 4, the will that built the weapon. Iran's strategic patience and the spirit that sanctions could not extinguish. 600 Fate 313 missiles did not appear in Iran's arsenal last night. They were built over years, designed, tested, manufactured, and stockpiled through a sustained national effort that proceeded in the face of comprehensive economic warfare, international isolation, repeated physical attacks on the facilities and personnel involved in the development program, and the constant drumbeat aid of Western analytical dismissal that insisted Iran could not develop the capabilities it has now demonstrated. Understanding the human and institutional reality behind that development program is essential to understanding what Iran actually is as a strategic actor, because the Western frameworks that have consistently underestimated Iranian capability have done so precisely because they have failed to take seriously the depth of national purpose that drives Iranian strategic investment. The Fate missile family traces its development lineage to the early 1990s, to a period when Iran was emerging from the devastating 8-year war with Iraq that had consumed a generation of Iranian men and had exposed with brutal clarity the vulnerability of a nation dependent on foreign weapons suppliers whose support was conditional on political compliance. The war's conclusion produced a national strategic determination embedded not just in government policy, but in the institutional culture of the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the defense industrial organizations it oversees, that Iran would never again be strategically dependent on external suppliers for the capabilities it required to defend its interests. This determination produced the investment in indigenous defense manufacturing that has now culminated in the operational demonstration the world witnessed last night. The ballistic missile program, the drone development ecosystem, the naval mine and anti-H-ship missile capabilities, the air defense systems that contested Israeli F-15s over Lebanon. All of these are products of the same foundational national decision that strategic sovereignty requires the ability to build what you need, because the alternative is strategic dependence, and strategic dependence is strategic vulnerability. The sanctions that were supposed to prevent this capability from maturing instead accelerated the indigenization that made it ultimately impossible to interdict. When foreign components become unavailable, Iranian engineers develop domestic alternatives. When foreign technical expertise becomes inaccessible, Iranian universities and research institutions develop the domestic expertise to substitute for it. The sanctions that were designed as a tool of strategic coercion became paradoxically a driver of the strategic self-sufficiency that has produced the capability now burning on the waters of Hormuz. The specific engineers, technicians, and military officers who built the Fate 313 program include individuals who survived assassination campaigns, who watched colleagues killed by magnetic bombs attached to their vehicles, who worked in facilities subjected to cyber attacks and physical sabotage, who continued their work in the knowledge that the programs they were advancing made them targets of the most sophisticated intelligence services in the world. That they continued, that the program survived the attacks and emerged stronger rather than weaker, is the most important data point in understanding the depth of institutional commitment that drives Iranian strategic development. This is the dimension of the current confrontation that American strategic culture finds most difficult to process. The American approach to adversary motivation tends to model adversaries as rational actors whose behavior is primarily responsive to incentives and costs. Actors who can be deterred by the credible threat of punishment or induced to accommodate by the prospect of reward. This model works reasonably well against adversaries whose strategic behavior is primarily driven by calculated interest.